So, we should pin down a plan of action for the rest of the day, Andrej informed, over a shared communication line between everyone who was part of James's accompaniment for the conference, some 10 minutes after they arrived, so everyone had at least the briefest amount of time to settle in.
I still can't believe you were put in charge of this mission, even though both Shida and I outrank you.
Coco was the first to, rather unhelpfully, reply. Cry about it, Andrej quickly responded, without a hint of hesitation. Also, technically James is in charge. Speaking of whom, what's on the agenda, James? James sighed slightly, and rubbed his eyes with an amused expression at the bickering. Well, Shida and I are planning on seeing if we can't pay a visit to one of our fellow occupants, but it's probably better if we don't bring our armed escort for that, he replied, with a hint of humour in his voice. That should hopefully take no more than an hour, if not most likely less, so everyone else can ideally use that time to settle in a bit more. And after that, I'd say we go scout out our own location. Familiarise ourselves with the surroundings, threatening positions, and possible escape routes and so on. No idea how long we'll take for that, but I'd say after that we can probably grab some food, either in our rooms or we'll scout out a fitting location. Sound good? Roger, Roger, Andrej replied, seemingly having no issue with that. I'll grab Admir and Sam and scout out the venue digitally, so we have an idea what to look out for. It's always me, Admir chimed in, with a playful, woe is me kind of tone.
I'll be right over, Major,
Athena then also informed her boss.
James, would you maybe like for someone who is not part of your armed escort to come along for that meeting?
Moore's voice then asked after a couple of moments over the same line.
Maybe the presence of someone else might be a bit of a mitigating factor in your approach, since it seems that your presence here is already perceived as sort of problematic.
James thought about it, but ultimately shook his head to himself. I think rocking up with any more than absolutely necessary could be seen as needlessly hostile, he explained as his answer. We're just going over to have a quick chat. It's not like we're approaching a hostile nation or anything like that. If we feel the need for backup, you're all literal measures away.
All right then, but please be careful,
Moore conceded after a moment.
And for goodness sake, mind your manners, Nia chimed in, adding on to that. You're representing humanity here. Remember that.
Yes, Mum, James replied with an amused eye roll, before muting the connection and briefly stepping in front of a mirror to bring his hair into some semblance of form, with a few quick swipes of his hands. Turning to his girlfriend after he was satisfied with his appearance, he reached out his arms. How do I look? He asked jovially. Shida's pretty glum expression briefly broke into a mild smirk. Positively alien, she replied, before walking up to him with her tail swaying, and briefly reaching out her hand to wipe away at his chest, smoothing out some minor wrinkles. As she did so, her gaze was inadvertently pulled along his right arm, finally coming to a halt as her eyes landed on his textured, grey synthetic hand. Do you have your glove? She asked, with her ears flicking. Her own look at the prosthetic was about as casual as it could get. However, in her expression, there was a hint of restrained worry that sat somewhere in the back of her mind. I don't think I'm going to bother with it, James explained, and shrugged mildly while depositing the hand into his pants pocket. You saw that other Laksha set. They didn't bother hiding their eye. Besides, if I'm going to represent humanity, it's probably time that I start doing so without hiding away some of our more unique aspects, don't you think? Shida looked at him with the mildest hint of worry. However, she also smirked again. The primates aren't going to like that, she informed him, her cheeky tone not matching the statement at all, and neither did the brush of her tail that coyly went alongside his arm as she spoke. They don't like me already, James replied with a soft scoff. To which Shida then reached up and began to impishly tussle through his freshly ordered hair. James pulled his head away quickly, but it was already too late. "What'd you do that for?" he asked, as he turned back to the mirror in annoyance to try and salvage what was salvageable. However, as he raised his hand, Sheila quickly caught it by the wrist and held it in place. As he turned to see what she wanted, she simply lifted her other hand, that was holding his breath filter that loosely dangled from her fingers. "Forget something?" she then asked with a raised eyebrow, to which James quickly scrunched his eyes shut tight. "Right. Let's not mention this to anyone," he then chuckled, before gingerly accepting the mask helmet-like item from her. "Oh, you know I will," Sheila replied, sticking out her tongue playfully. "I know you will," James agreed with a mild sigh. Barely a few minutes later, the two high-class Deathworlders found themselves on top of the roof of the hive once again, loosely surrounded by a comparatively large number of their peers that currently inhabited this structure. "Wow, from Class 1 to 5, we really have everything here," Sheila mumbled, as she looked around at some of the surrounding species that entered and exited their rooms all over the hive, interspersed with a large number of Rushgak workers that went about their duties. "Not all that surprising given it is a Deathworlder conference," James replied, with his hands in his pockets, also letting his gaze glide around. Then, his eyes followed a yellow line on the ground that was labelled with the word "Conference." Seeing where it led, he mentioned, "That's the direction they went off to earlier, isn't it?" Sheila nodded, and together they began to follow the line across the roof, eventually finding that it led into yet another hole in the ground. However, with this one, they were confronted with a mild problem, as the door leading downwards was labelled with the words "Authorised personnel only," meaning that, even if it would open for them, they most likely weren't allowed in there. Usually not much of a hurdle for either of them, but they were here on official business. And, as James had been so helpfully reminded earlier, that meant that he should better be on his best behaviour. James growled to himself while looking down at the written letters, as if they had personally offended him. Right. Makes sense. What now? However, as he turned over towards Sheila to see if she had any ideas, he soon noticed that her face had become rather scrunched up, while her ears twitched around lively, seemingly picking up on something he didn't hear. The expression she showed was a mixture of recognition, disbelief, and serious distaste. "Oh, you can't be," she began to whisper as she turned around, with James immediately following the movement. However, she seemingly swallowed the rest of her sentence, as the two of them then found themselves confronted with two figures approaching them. Bipedal, about their size, with twitching ears and swinging tails. One tanned with seriously dark stripes, one pale with only a grey hint of the Mia patterns. Both amber and sky blue eyes were staring right back at them, as James and Sheila regarded the approaching men with a careful anticipation. "Saint Aldwyn," Quaffin greeted, his large ears rustling through his wild white hair, as he regarded the human before him with a cold stare that didn't exactly match his welcoming tone. "I guess I should have expected meeting you here as well, yet it comes as a pleasant surprise. Did you arrive only recently?" The emphasis he put onto the word "pleasant" made shudders chase each other down James's back. However, he did his best to not let it show. "Quafrem," he greeted back restrainedly, or taking up a more proper and closed-off posture, as the two parties met on eye level. "And I see you brought Loijavar with you as well. It's good to see you in good health. We did indeed arrive only recently, and I take it that nickname has already started to spread out, even outside our territories." He bit his tongue against making any more snide remark on being called Saint by an official representative like that. Keeping up appearances was part of the job, after all. The pale feline chuckled to himself, although his eyes still remained humorless. Of course it has. Hilarious, don't you think? He informed with lifting ears. James exhaled slowly. Maybe conceptually, he admitted, leaving out the part where it was far less funny to actually be affected by what that title brought with it, ultimately. He then shook his head, and decided to bring this conversation, if he had to have it already, at least into a positive direction. I take it you are here for the Deathworlder conference? Confronting released a dismissive chuff. As the leader of Dunama's leading Comaltoperno, the organizers indeed saw it fit to invite me to these proceedings, as our representative, he replied thoughtfully, with slightly raised hands. Meanwhile, Lloyd-Javar tilted his weight to the side slightly, clearly trying his best to gaze past James and Sheeda, and get a look at the door on the ground. Are you on your way to meet with our organizers as well? The assistant then candidly asked, as he seemingly saw where they had tried to go, his ears flicking slightly as he spoke. We need to discuss something concerning our accommodations. You wouldn't mind if we joined you, right? Although hidden by his breath filter, James's eye twitched slightly. But, feeling like there was absolutely no point in childishly trying to hide their circumstances, he ultimately pulled himself together. Maybe he could even use this to their advantage. We were indeed on our way to speak with one of the organizers. However, I believe you are under a misconception here, he explained casually, and raised his hands into a shrug, seeing the feline's eyes twinkle slightly, as he revealed his mechanical hand in the process. Unlike you, we were actually not invited to the Deathworlder conference, and are instead here for a different event. We just happened to book a room in the Rushgak hive out of convenience. James had half expected that those two already knew that much, and that they had just tried to tease him with the fact that he should technically not be here. However, the held-back surprise on Quafrem's face, as he lifted a single eyebrow with widening eyes, and Lloyd-Javar's curiously twitching ears, informed him that his assumption had apparently been wrong. It seemed like they had honestly expected for him to be part of the proceedings as well. Using their moment of being taken aback, he quickly pushed the topic further, as he stepped slightly aside, to reveal the door behind him more openly. However, it seems like we'll have to wait until they are done with their business behind closed doors, before we'll get our conversation, he mentioned with a shrug, before extending his mechanical arm in the direction of the door invitingly. But I don't want to hold you up any longer than necessary. The felines both blinked twice, seemingly not quite sure what to make of any of this. After a moment, Quafrem then even leaned over closely to his assistant, quietly whispering something directly into his ear. Although James could see Sheeda's ears attentively twitch next to him, he highly doubted even she would be able to make out what was being said. After a moment, the whispered and the whisperer changed positions, as Lloyd-Javar said something to his boss in return, before the two of them once again glanced at James and Sheeda, who still stood in the same position in front of them. Once again, there was a bit of a twinkle in their eyes, as they straightened back up into their proper positions. In that case, would you like to accompany us? Quafrem offered with a gesture, in the direction of the door. I would like you to inspect the premises as an outside guest. Even if you are not invited, you are still a Deathworlder, much like ourselves. I think it would be appropriate to at least let you get a picture of what will possibly help decide the future of our people. Underneath his mask, James narrowed his eyes slightly, as he tried to figure out what gain exactly Quafrem saw in taking him along. Not that he hadn't sort of expected that he could lead the conversation towards an outcome like this, with some luck. However, this seemed a bit too easy. Still, Whatever gain the felines saw in this action, it would also benefit James enough that he felt like it was most likely worth the risk. Still, if he knew one thing about Miat, it was that he shouldn't agree too easily. Well, would that be allowed? He therefore wanted aloud, and glanced back and forth between Quafrem and the door. I don't want to cause any incidents. Quafrem snickered as a reply, and for the first time, his eyes actually shared the humour of his voice. I'm the representative of the second biggest Deathworld population there is, he informed James, with a single revealed fang. The biggest, if you don't count humanity, as it appears our hosts do. I found that my word has a surprising amount of weight here, and besides, out of the large entourage of people I was technically allowed to bring, I am only accompanied by Loijavar during my stay here. Therefore, if anyone decides to raise an incident, we can simply proclaim you to be part of my accompaniment. He laughed once again in predatory huffs. Mulling that over for a moment, James decided that had been enough resistance. Repeating his earlier inviting gesture, he stepped to the side a bit more. After you, then, he said, with a mild nod of his head, and allowed the felines to walk past him. The two men approached the door and opened it so casually that it seemed they had already done it a number of times during their stay here. Meanwhile, James's gaze turned towards Sheeda, as he noticed that she was staring absolute daggers at the men, now that they had turned around. You all right? He asked, deliberately switching to English so their current company hopefully wouldn't be able to eavesdrop on their conversation. Still absolutely livid at those guys, Sheeda admitted, without a moment's hesitation, her eyes turning damn near murderous for a second. There's no way that attack went through without them knowing. Dunama's defenses are too tight for that. James took a long inhale and very slowly allowed the air to escape out of his lungs in an even stream. I know, he then replied, once he could be sure that his emotions wouldn't start boiling up as well. But sadly we can't just accost him out in the open like this. I'm sure investigations on Dunama are already running red hot. Attacking or otherwise confronting him on the topic without any idea what is actually being done will cause way more harm than good. Sheeda released a hissing breath through her teeth. So we're just supposed to let yet another criminal run around scot-free because investigations are still running? She asked, in a rather confronting tone that she clearly had trouble keeping at a low volume. James closed his eyes. Sadly, that's how it works, he replied resignedly. We would know. After all, we use that to our advantage just as much as he is doing right now. I'm sure our mutual friend is already doing everything within her power to pin down his connection to that attack. We shouldn't make it harder on her by tipping him off to that. He deliberately avoided using Avesalon's name, since even while speaking a different language, Quafrem surely would have picked up on that familiar sound in their conversation. Sheeda grumbled slightly, in incoherent word fractions. Don't know if I should be impressed or pissed that you are so calm about that, she finally stated, after seemingly getting all the venom she wanted to spew out of her system for the time being. James bit the inside of his lip. I've just got more practice in hiding than you, he admitted, and also threw a searing glare at the back of the pale feline's head. I'm absolutely livid as well. As they walked through the halls, James absently took note of some of the surroundings. It seemed that this venue was, for a good part, still under construction. Large banners were laying on the ground and leaned against the wall instead of being hung up under the high, honey-yellow ceilings. Chairs and cots of many different sizes littered the sides of the halls in large stacks, seemingly waiting to be assembled into a sensible formation so a large number of people could share this space with each other. In front of them, a large stage was still stripped down to its bare bones, with the framework and scaffolding that held it up clearly visible to the outside world, while thick tarps and coverings that would usually be used to hide it away hung still rolled up at its sides. Wires and cores were littering the ground everywhere, not yet organized and stored away in any sensible manner, as everyone simply opted to climb over them. In short, there was still a hefty amount of work to be done before any conference could be held here, even if participants were already starting to arrive. If James had to guess, these were most likely the visible growing pains of the first official time that the Deathworlders currently living in the community came together in such a fashion. However, if they wanted to get taken seriously, he sure hoped they would clean all of this up before the first vultures of the media would catch scent of it. On top of the skeletal stage, the arriving group could already see the people they had been looking for. The enormous form of the Legormadillar was quite obviously hard to miss, as they didn't even need to stand up on the stage to absolutely dwarf everyone else in the room, including the already rather large Rushgak king that James had met earlier. And in comparison, the Lakshazet might as well have just been decoration, as they crouched in front of large speakers, holding small devices attached to microphones in their hand, as they presumably measured the volume. "Alright, try again," the Volping with the large scar under his face announced, and held his microphone as high up into the air as he could, before his ears slightly twitched as the noise from the approaching group seemingly caught his attention.
Hello, everybody!
The Legormadillar loudly addressed the empty room at his command. Their voice was as enormous as their body, and therefore they had absolutely no need for any sort of amplification, as it boomed throughout the entire structure, causing the many fine-hearing felines and Volpins in the room to collectively flinch at their words and fold their ears downwards.
I welcome you to the first official council of...
As they continued, one could barely hear the much meeker voice of the Lakshazet start to scream over them, as he loudly announced, alright, stop it! You're still way too loud!" while waving his arms wildly to gain the Colossus's attention. Stopping short in the middle of their sentence, the Legormadillar chortled slightly and leaned down, once again catching their weight with the huge digging claws that usually cover their chest as they brought their head down.
Right, I'm sorry. I just get so excited about speaking in front of so many people,
they explained much more softly, the scales on their large back rattling slightly, as they shifted their body in clearly pretended coyness. The Lakshazet scowled at them. "Be excited all you want, but keep in mind you've got lungs the size of train cars," he admonished the Colossus, with a clear and utter disregard of the size and power discrepancy between them. "We can't turn the amps up to match you if you talk like that. We'll blow everyone's ears out. Try to use your inside voice even while giving your speech." He didn't exactly give the giant any chance to reply, because he then immediately turned his head towards the room's entrance, with his eyes annoyedly narrowing. His neck turning almost all the way around like an owl's, he gave the approaching people a displeased look. "You again," he then announced, and the fixed nature of the Lakshazet's eyes made it hard for James to tell who exactly he was trying to look at and address. However, he assumed that he might be the target of the Volping's vexation. Feeling like him speaking up right away could only lead to chaos, he decided to noticeably nod in the direction of Quafrem. The pale feline seemed to be entirely shameless, as he immediately stepped forth with his arms extended. "Virus Grata," he loudly announced, and the direction of his gaze led James to assume that that might be the name of the Rushgak king, who seemed to chitter in an odd way, as he noticed the feline addressing him. "I've come to converse with you about a little problem Loijivar and I noticed in our rooms. Could you possibly spare a minute of your time?" There was a sort of shudder that seemed to go through the insectoid's entire body. His wings fluttered for a moment, and his shears-like mouthparts briefly fiddled with each other. However, ultimately, He set himself into motion and slowly skittered towards the approaching tycoon to meet him halfway. "Of course," he announced, before reaching out an arm to indicate for Kwafwem to step aside to a corner of the room with him. James noticed that the Lakshaset's gaze seemed to follow the men as they left, and for a moment he wondered if maybe he had misjudged who the Vulpine had been talking to. Meanwhile, he also saw in the corner of his vision that an artificial yellow eye was once again directed squarely at him in a barely hidden stare. Then, the head of the scarred Lakshaset already snapped back around to him, and with it, also the large dark eyes of the Lugormodilar. Loijavar turned to James with a slightly bemused smirk on his face. "Do you require assistance?" he asked, only briefly glancing at the intense glares that were thrown in James's direction. "We'll be fine," James replied firmly, and waved the man off, to which Loijavar barely did more than scoff before he gradually sauntered after his boss towards the corner of the room. Briefly looking at Sheeda to see how she was faring, James saw that she had calmed herself quite a bit, and now mostly seemed slightly apprehensive about approaching the man she believed to have injured once upon a time. Lifting his hand, he encouragingly patted her on the shoulder, snapping her attention out of whatever rut it was digging itself into, before offering her his hand to take. Feeling her clamp down on it with nervous force, James smiled underneath his mask, which the pixelated projection on his visor likely projected to the outside world, and began to walk over to the conference's hosts, only needing to pull the reluctant feline along the slightest bit.
"I thought you said you weren't interested in disturbing the conference," the enormous Lugormodilar warningly mentioned towards James, while their dark eyes kept fixating on him. At this point, James had been long past being intimidated by people who were taller than him, and the Deathworlder's face was so much more, for a lack of a better term, approachable than those of so many other species he'd had to deal with, that he couldn't really muster any intimidation from it. "And we're not here for the conference," he therefore confirmed for them, in an even and casual tone, "only on personal matters." With that, he loosened his gaze from the Colossus and turned his head in the direction of the Lakshaset, who now turned his body so his head would face forwards again, while looking at him and crossing his arms over the dusty apron he wore. His eyes didn't stay on James for long, because soon they turned over to Sheeda. James felt her hand clench down tighter as the Vulpine looked at her. "My eyes didn't deceive me, then," the Lakshaset then opened without any preamble, their sharp canines sticking out from under their lips as they spoke. "You really are that same Miat." Inadvertently, one of his hands loosened from his cross-arm posture, to instead glide over the scars on his neck. Sheeda just nodded, her yellow eyes locking with the green orbs of the man. Then, the Lakshaset briefly broke their eye contact, as his head instead turned in a way that allowed his stiff eyes to look down at James's right arm, mild consideration entering his face. "Seems like a lot has changed," he commented. "Seems like it indeed," Sheeda agreed, taking a moment to look around the in-progress organizing of the conference around them. "You've cleaned up your act. And you no longer fight for the wrong side," the Lakshaset announced in return. However, as his eyes came back around to her, he briefly scanned up and down her dark UHSTF uniform. At least, not the same one. James's eyes widened a bit at how direct the man was being. However, even if he couldn't reciprocate it, he couldn't exactly say that he didn't at least appreciate it a bit. "I'll take that as a compliment," he therefore commented with a mild chuckle. Now that he had officially integrated himself into the conversation, the Vulpine also briefly looked directly into his eyes, before his head once again twitched down to the mechanical arm. "St. Aldwyn,"
he mumbled in a tone that clearly indicated he wasn't quite sure of what to make of that name, even as he used it. However, then, he came a step towards him and candidly reached out one of his slender arms. "Would you mind if I took a quick gander?" He nodded towards the arm, as if needing to clarify what he was talking about. James interestedly tilted his head and very briefly glanced over at the other cyborg in the room, before wordlessly agreeing and holding his mechanical arm out for inspection. With careful precision, the paws of the Lakshasette gently felt alongside the textured surface, pressing in along the segments of metal bone with fingers sleekly gliding across the flow of the artificial muscles. After a few long seconds, he seemed to be satisfied. "That is good work," he informed, with a look up at the much taller human. "May I ask who made it?" The question seemed innocuous. However, something about the tone he said it with made James listen up. Even more so as he noticed that the second Lakshasette almost imperceptibly took a step back, while also defensively bringing their arms up to their chest, almost as if they feared the question would cause great offense. Lifting an unseen eyebrow, James decided to simply reply honestly. "It was designed and engineered by a friend of mine, and then installed by one of our military doctors on the A Place in the Sun, after I disliked the first, more standard prosthetic that I had originally been given after losing my arm," he informed professionally. As a reply, the Lakshasette scoffed strongly and exposed all of his sharp teeth in what James interpreted as a grin, but could have been all kinds of different, more alien things. "Then it's really true," he mumbled for a moment, before extending his hand in a rather human-like gesture as he introduced himself. "Livexar, of the higher Mictmarie family." James carefully accepted the hand, making sure he wouldn't grasp it firmly like he was used to. "James Aldwyn," he uselessly introduced himself, although he was already known. The Lakshasette nodded and pulled his hand back at first, before once again extending it, this time towards Sheeda. "Sheeda," the feline introduced herself, shaking the hand gingerly. She paused for a moment before she added, "I'm not sorry for what I've done, but I'm sorry that it happened." Livexar exhaled in a slightly bitter manner, but seemed to smile it off. "I had a gun to your head," he then seemingly admitted to himself. "Guess I can't demand more than that."
"I am certain I am missing something."
The Legormodullar's loud voice informed the room as they watched the scene unsurely. Livexar's ears twitched slightly. "I'll explain it to you once our current company is satisfied with his room once again," he informed the Colossus, although the tone with which he said it, as well as the dark, contemplative expression on his face as he did, clued James into the fact that he, too, would only be able to get explanations once their current company, in the form of Quafrem, was no longer present. "Why don't you introduce yourself in the meantime, big guy?" The Legormodullar shifted his head unsurely, but ultimately, it seemed like an innate enthusiasm was overtaking hesitation.
"Gladly,"
he announced, now crawling around on the spot so he could turn his entire mass towards James and Sheeda.
"I am Morgoth Strentane, Shepherd of the Strentane Caverns, 8 through 17. It is, despite what you may think, a pleasure to make your acquaintance."
Although their earlier behaviour was not gone from his awareness yet, it seemed to James like the Colossus's enthusiasm was absolutely real, as their face absolutely lit up while they announced their name and, title? "The pleasure is all mine," James replied with a bow of his head, and Sheeda copied the motion, wordlessly agreeing with him. "You're the first Legormodullar I've met. How does it feel to be the number one among Deathworlders? After all, we humans missed the mark by one classification." Morgoth erupted into a thunderous, sparking laugh.
I don't make much of those labels,
he more proclaimed than said, as he reared up slightly, so his voice would be directed at the ceiling, instead of the small people in front of him.
But, if it means more people will flock towards us, I will gladly take it upon me.
The reputation certainly helps with attention,
a much softer voice agreed, as it seemed that the second Lakshasette finally found the courage to also approach the group, both her yellow and green eye firmly locked onto James. Seemingly not seeing the need to drag things out, she immediately extended her hand.
Ajaxier, of the lower Norkshtaka family.
Feeling like this was exactly what she wanted, James took her hand into his mechanical one, as he reciprocated her greeting. And indeed, there was the slightest hint of glee on her face as she felt his polymeric skin make contact with hers. I hope your arm is treating you better than my arm is treating me, James said, with an overplayed sore laugh, before slightly rotating his other shoulder that held the counterweights to the mechanical appendage. There was a slight moment of shock in the Vulpine's organic eye as he brought the topic up. However, after just a moment of acclamation, Ajaxier's hand reached up to the rust-red metal that surrounded her yellow eye, tenderly gliding across it.
It is doing its best,
she said, in a very soft tone. James briefly looked over at Sheeda to see her reaction, and, as he probably should have expected, there was basically none. It seemed that the days of her being bothered by mechanics were truly over. However, after his gaze lingered a moment too long, it seemed like his girlfriend felt like he was trying to insinuate something. Either that, or she just felt the need to break the tension because she quickly assured him, I swear, I didn't scratch that one out as well. James couldn't quite help but laugh aloud at that, while Ajaxier meekly pulled back her hand, almost seeming embarrassed at the insinuation, although she obviously knew how she had lost the eye. However, glancing over at Kwafwem, who still seemed to be locked in conversation with the Rushgak, who had the patience of an actual saint it seemed, James saw a bit of a chance at subtlety. Well, if you are ever looking to exchange stories, the doors of me and a friend of mine are always open. I'm sure Curie would be thrilled to hear about your experiences with your cybernetic bits, he explained with mild enthusiasm, also glancing over at Levexar as he said it. The look in the Lakshaset's eyes told him that the man understood the message. We can talk privately in our rooms. Come by sometime, James added onto his previous statement, feeling like there wasn't much to gain here at the moment anymore.
We might just do that,
Levexar replied in Ajaxier's stead, before he turned to Sheeda.
It has been surprisingly nice meeting you again.
The feeling's mutual, Sheeda replied briefly, very clearly still a bit unsure of how to feel. Then, as she and James already turned to leave, Ajaxier unexpectedly made a hasty step forwards, with her arm extended.
Wait, she burst out. Before you go, one more question.
James and Sheeda stopped in place and glanced at each other, before looking back at the woman expectantly. Ajaxier came to a halt and nervously stepped in place, with her hands fiddling with the many pockets of her apron. Then, she looked up to directly stare at where she expected James's eyes to be underneath the mask.
Is it true, as well?
She whispered, giving no additional context to the question. However, James still understood exactly what she meant. Too bad for her, though, because he couldn't answer that. I have no idea what you're talking about, he replied, before gesturing a drop it in sign with his free hand, as he turned to leave yet again, leaving Ajaxier to just stand there, with her eyes wide open.